So hello and welcome to Layer 7's webinar on API discovery and promotion. My name is Dana Crane. I'm the product manager here for Layer 7's API management solutions. I'm going to be your host today for the hour, and I have with me the founder and visionary for the web's premier API registry, a yellow pages of APIs, if you will. I have with me John Musser of ProgrammableWeb.
Hi, Dana. Good morning.
Good morning. Just before we get started, I'm going to go through a couple of housekeeping issues. We're going to be taking questions today. We have a Q&A slot at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions, you can enter them directly right here in the chat window or in the Q&A window, or you can tweet them to us at hashtag L7webinar, or you can even go to our Facebook page and paste them on the wall. We'll be collecting all of those questions throughout the webinar, and we'll replay them at the end so either John or I can get you answers for them. But right now, I'm going to pass the baton over to John and let John get started. Go ahead, John.
All right. Thanks, Dana. Good morning, everybody. I want to sort of do a couple of things here to set the stage, because I think the grand stage is we want to talk about getting your API promoted, and I think a big part of what that is about is what's going on in the API universe. So let's talk a little bit about what we've seen, and then also dig into the promoting your API. So first off, for those of you who don't know ProgrammableWeb, we've been around for 7 years, and we have the core of what we offer is our API directory, which today has over 6,000 APIs. And we've done over 3,000 news stories in the past 7 years. So we're basically all APIs all the time. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of things. First of all, here's the history. This timeline is the history of open APIs on the web since the year 2000, which is really the first open web API, which was eBay, by the way. And you can see in 2005, things really started to take off. And if we sort of go through what's happened and use the metric of how long did it take to get 1,000 APIs, if we look here, it took 8 years to get that first 1,000 APIs out there. But to get that second 1,000 APIs, to get to 2,000, only took 18 months. It took 9 months to get to 3,000, only took 6 months to get to 4, it took 4 months to get to 5,000, and then this year, as we crossed the 6,000 API milestone, it only took 3 months. And the point is that this market's accelerating. We're seeing tremendous growth in the number of web-based APIs. And this doesn't mean free APIs. It just means APIs that are available over the web. So it can be paid APIs, free APIs. It doesn't matter. So let's talk a little bit about what we see as the key drivers behind that growth and the technology decisions, which then starts to lead into, okay, how are you going to get your API successful? And promotion, really part of it is viral. It's about how do you get developers excited about your API, how do you get people to actually use your API. So here's one of the first, we'll do a little bit as a hot or not game here, but on the left and right here, you have 2 ways to get the stock price of IBM. And the fact of the matter is that of these 2, which is hot, it's the one on the right. That's the REST style, the representational state transfer model of getting a stock price, of making an API call, right? It's a simple GET call. And you can see even from this example how much simpler that is. And again, this is just a fundamental small step in an indirect way of API promotion, because your API will be more likely to be adopted and you'll make developers happy, and they'll do the promotion for you. And we'll come back to that theme many times. How popular is REST? Well, if you take a look at those 6,000 APIs that I showed you a moment ago, we keep track of, on ProgrammableWeb, what style or protocol they use, whether it's REST or SOAP or JavaScript. And here you can see on the y-axis quantity and on the x-axis time. And there's no question there that the blue line, the REST line, is running away from the pack. It's not even close, not even close. And that's because that's what developers are asking for. That's what the market has said we want. Now, flip side of that, we're showing you how to make the call, or what's popular making the call. Here's the actual representation of the IBM stock price, 2 ways to do it. Which one's hot, the left or the right? Well, again, following the theme of simplicity, it's the one on the left. It's the JSON model. It's the way of representing that same piece of data, that stock price. And again, you can see how much more straightforward and simple it is. It's also lighter weight. So as you're developing mobile applications, that's always going to take less bandwidth to make that kind of call. So we're doing that kind of data. Again, how do we know? What's the data behind this? Take a look at this. Here's percentage of REST APIs that support JSON as a data format. So one of the things that we track, and you can look, here's 2006. Back in that year, that top blue line, less than 10% of the APIs that came out back in 2006 supported JSON as a data format. Just a tiny percentage. And back then, nobody could envision that JSON was going to be what it is today, because look at those lines. In 2012, over half, that's 60% of all the APIs that have been released this year support JSON as a data format. And if you notice, there's two blue lines there. That lower dark blue bar, that's APIs that support only JSON as a data format. They don't support XML at all. And you can see that's also getting larger to the point where now, in 2012, almost a third of all the APIs that have been released this year only support JSON as a data format. They've actually given up on XML as a data format. So you can sort of draw the line straight through those to see where this is going. Again, helps to promote your API because you make developers happy and you really want them to do the promotion for you. So now, APIs, we see there are a lot more APIs than there used to be. Another measure of how the impact they're having is when you're really successful and you promoted your API well, you're going to be a member of the API Billionaire Club. And that is APIs where the transaction volume for those APIs is measured in the day, the week, the month, in billions. And so here are 8 APIs. You recognize probably all these names, or certainly most of them. These companies are all doing more than 1 billion API calls a day, or developers on top of their platforms. So those are huge volumes, and they're clearly strategic assets for these companies. That's not all. There are other companies that are in that same league now, whether it's Salesforce, again, that's a paid API, right? So that's a commercial SaaS service in the cloud. But again, doing billions of API calls a month, more than half of all their transaction volume at Salesforce is from their API. AT&T, NPR, you recognize these names. So these are folks that have done a tremendous job in encouraging developers to build on this platform. So now let's dig a little bit more into the promotion piece. First of all, take a look here. There's no, how do you get, APIs are different than other things that your company might want to promote. And developers are different. And so how do you get them excited and engaged? How do you inform them about what your API does? As you can see from this slide, it's probably not what's going on the left. It's what's going on the right, and that's a hackathon. Hackathons right now are a super popular and hot way to promote your API. Let's look at this data here. A fellow named Kim Lane tracks this, and you can see that there are, in Q1, by the end of March, there were 68 hackathons in that 1 month alone. You'd have to be on a plane doing 2 hackathons a day to even try and keep up. And last year, look at that, Max Prize 2011 was over $100,000 at 1 hackathon. So they're not a guaranteed way to succeed in promoting your API, but if they're done well, they really can be a great way to get people engaged in building things on your platform, understanding how your API works, and having output and again, that viral word of mouth. That's another way. Well, another way, if you're coming into the space, is to look at companies that are doing a great job of promoting their APIs. So I hold out here 2 examples of startups who are doing a tremendous job of promoting their APIs. On the left, you have Twilio. On the right, you have Stripe. One's in communications, voice and SMS. The other's in payments. But I encourage you to go to their website, see how they promote their APIs, how they talk to developers, how they do documentation. Everything we talk about in this webinar I think to a large part can be encapsulated on what they do, on what they do on their site. Now, those two companies happen to be at the forefront of this movement where an API isn't something that extends your brand or extends your website. They actually are the company. They are the product. So here's examples. All these logos are companies that are there today, including big ones like Amazon Web Services, where your primary customer is the developer. And so these guys, everything that they do about marketing and sales and support is all about the developer. And again, that's what we're talking about today. So take a look at those companies for good examples. And as a follow-on to that idea, another thought about promoting your API is how should you, if you have an existing company that has been around for a year, 10 years, 20 years, we're starting to see a few companies brand their API separately. So sometimes they want to have a distinct brand for their API. So here's a couple of examples of, for example, something called the Supermarket API. It's from a startup called Aisle Finder, and they decided that having a distinct name for the API separate from the company was a good way to brand and distinguish that product or platform. Now back to hot or not. Here's two examples of API documentation. Now you might be saying, well, how can API documentation be even hot? Why would you dare call it hot? And I'll give you an example. It's the one on the right, and that is interactive documentation. That, because this is on the web, and these are web pages, and you have a web-based API, you can actually make your docs live. And again, this makes a difference because one of your primary goals in promoting your API is how quickly is the 0 to 60 moment? How quickly can a developer be up and running to do the Hello World application on our platform? The faster that happens, the easier you make that, the more likely you are to win. Here's an example from the WordNick API, where in their interactive documentation, you put in the parameters, you pick the method, put in the parameters, hit the go button, and you can see the results right there live based on what you entered. So I encourage you, and you can look at they have an open source product called Swagger, SWAGGER, swagger.wordnick, and you can go find, you can download that and do it yourself. Now, the last thing I want to touch on in this piece of the webinar is how ProgrammableWeb works. It's generally considered the best practice to get your API listed on ProgrammableWeb. So when you have a new API, it's free, just list it, and it becomes part of our directory because this is where developers come to discover APIs and learn what's in a given space. And here's how we work. And as you can see, here's an example of an API, what we call an API profile page. And it obviously it's a little hard to see the small scale, but the fact is that there are a number of elements that make it almost like going to an Amazon.com product page because the API is your product. And so here you have pieces that are from the database, from algorithms like recommendations, you have personalized pieces, and then you have community. And I think that all those add up to what makes an API successful and what makes promoting your API successful. And I'll pick up on that last part. It's making your API social. This is different than it was 10 or 20 years ago in talking to developers and things like SDKs and MSDN days. Here's examples on ProgrammableWeb of how we make API social, whether that's community, whether that's promotion, surveys, polls, forums, all those things that make them and the developers feel like they're engaged. And lastly, think about what are complementary APIs or services, because all through here, part of what makes APIs different and unique is that the whole idea of mashups, for example, that you're taking these components and these pieces and gluing them together. And so that's also part of the promotion puzzle. Think about what the hackathons. Very rarely is a hackathon run, occasionally it's by one company, but more often they're run by a set of companies. And that helps with the ethos, it helps promotion, it helps get, again, engagement with your platform. And finally, I just sort of want to draw the analogy here that seeing what's going on with APIs and the growth, in a previous era of the internet, and that really was back in the late 90s when people didn't really know what a website was for, and then it wasn't very long, and of course we have one of those, and it wasn't too many years ago people didn't know what API stood for, why we would have one for a website, and now we're entering an era where this is a given, and so it becomes like a business requirement to understand how to make this part of your strategy and make your business model into your API and go forward and promote and succeed. And with that, I'll hand it back to David.
Great. Thanks, John. Just transfer back to me. And that was a lot of great information. I'm going to sort of reset things here for a minute and talk about where this whole API movement came from, and then we'll talk about promotion and discovery. So the APIs we're talking about today aren't your grandpa's APIs. API has really evolved over the enterprise in time, and now it's one of those primary vehicles for exposing your internal business to external entities. So for example, today your IT team is employing those APIs to, for instance, integrate your on-site SAP deployment with Salesforce.com, or maybe they're sharing accounts across divisions, or taking orders from your supply chains for your APIs, or even empowering your mobile workforce. So in this way, those IT guys, those overworked and underappreciated IT guys, they're making use of these enterprise APIs, and they've been doing it for years, and they've been adding tremendous value along the way. Well, that was then, and this is now. So today, you've got customers and partners, and the way they want to interact with the enterprise is via mobile devices, or via the web, or via cloud-based applications, or some other emerging platform. But to get on those platforms, the enterprises would have to create basically a whole new division. They've got to build, they've got to market, they've got to sell, support, and maintain multiple applications for all of those channels. And that's unlikely that your CFO is going to give you approval for that. It's just not core to your business. So that's where these third-party developers come in. By opening up your APIs to third parties, those developers, they can act as a catalyst to grow out each of those areas of connectivity. And in that way, you can greatly extend your market reach and even amplify your business value. But if you open your APIs, will developers just show up? Well, unfortunately, in most cases, the answer is no. So as John has shown you in his presentation, we're dealing with an explosion of APIs over the last few years. That means that there's a lot of REST and JSON-based developers that you're vying for against all those other API vendors out there. So how do you grab their attention? You need a new business model, typically called B2D, or business to developer. Developers are really this new channel to market for you. They can be a channel to a new market that you've never entered, or they may allow you to penetrate new existing markets more effectively or efficiently, things you've never been in before. So as such, they should be treated in the same way you treat your other channels, and that means you're going to need a channel manager, somebody who's got funding to build out that developer community around your APIs. But unfortunately, building a community is something of a chicken and egg problem because, let's face it, developers are lazy. So what do developers do? Well, they go and do a Google search for an API, and then they filter those results by how big the community is or how active that community is. So let's say they just give you the benefit of the doubt and try your API anyway, but then they run into a problem. Now what? There should be a community that's available to provide those answers, and if they can't, well, the developer is just going to move on. All of which means that step one is building your community starts with promotion. So here's some slides about promoting your APIs. And in the spirit of John's hot or not slides, I'm going to offer some choices for promoting your APIs. And we'll see which one in Layer 7's experience has proven more effective. And maybe we can get John to chime in and talk about what he's seen out there as well. So first up, what we have here is getting the word out, an advocate for your APIs. Should you be relying on your API management vendor, the vendor who helped you expose those APIs, or should you be staffing up a position yourself? Well, in our experience, speaking from somebody in the vendor space, and you'll see I've got the Layer 7 logo on the slide here, you really want to hire somebody who's vendor neutral, such as Kin Lane is pictured here, and I think John mentioned him as well. These guys can help you conduct developer outreach programs like the hackathons that we saw, John was talking about, or else, you could even just hire somebody directly on staff. Their full-time job is just developer relations for your API, very much like Sun or Microsoft or Apple has done in the past with their developer relation positions. Vendors are great to help you learn the ropes, but you have to keep in mind the fact that that's not their core business. Promoting your APIs is not core to their business. At the end of the day, relying for an API promotion for your vendors is like relying on vendors for best practices. Only you know your business best. John, you want to
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is it's a huge point, I think, because for many organizations, this can be a challenge because that's a new role. There wasn't a slot in the org chart before something called API evangelist, so this can be a challenge, and that's why there is this idea that, well, A, you completely agree that it can make a huge difference, a huge impact on your success, and secondly, there are many ways to do it. So sometimes companies will start out with someone wearing that hat, so that's part of the responsibility, but nonetheless, they may have other jobs, but it still is recognized as a role. Ideally, you have a full-time person, or again, you can contract that out. And then on top of this, I think there's also maybe a part of what the developer then, the evangelist does is interact with developers because they in turn become the ideal way to get your word out. But it's the evangelist that can be that key conduit to make that happen.
Good point, man. I agree. Let's take the next one. Here we have API as a product. So John talked a little bit about API as a product or even API as a brand. He also showed that there's more and more APIs available every day. So I guess the question here is it more important to get to market now before your competitors beat you out, or should you be delaying market entry in order to ensure that you've sewn up all those loose ends, that you've really got a whole product? And the answer here, as the old adage states, the guy that invented the wheel was smart, but the guy that added 3 more, he was a genius. So creating a whole product is really key here. You need to include all those typical internal resources, the usual suspects. You've got to have good API docs. You've got to have a dedicated tech support resource. You've got to have a maintenance plan in place, an upgrade plan in place. Make sure you include the deprecation process as well. A lot of people get tripped up when they're deprecating one API and moving to a new version. Make sure that's smooth. You've got to have error reporting. Support for OAuth is key out there right now. Lots and lots of OAuth coming in from prospects and customers on our end. And of course, monitoring reporting capabilities so people can understand what's going on in the back end with your API. But there's also external resources. Don't forget those when you're creating a whole product. Third-party libraries to be included here. There's lots of good examples of third-party resources that can really help flesh out that product and provide something that's really a whole product to the marketplace. So I guess the key here is, I'll get John to weigh in a second, but the key here I think is to treat your API as a platform. It's going to evolve over time. It's not just a product that's shipped and done. History is littered with corpses of first-to-market losers, from Betamax to Palm Pilot to Netscape. You don't want to be one of them. John?
Right. And I think also just from a language perspective, in this slide, I think the whole product, it's important to distinguish what you were talking about versus that's also the whole support infrastructure to go along with it, as opposed to necessarily, some folks get tripped up by, and I think a classic mistake is thinking that you need to have all the functionality in your API that you want to have from the get-go. And that's not the case in terms of typically as an organization, there are a lot of things your API could do. A classic example is you can access data versus update data, read and write. I think it's important to know that you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to do everything at once in terms of what your API does. It's important to have all those things that, Dana, you were just talking about. All those things are very important, but in terms of your API itself, have a bit of core functionality, and at that point, you can be good to go and add additional functionality later. As you said, it's not at all. It doesn't end the day that you roll out your first V1 of your API.
Yeah, I agree. One example that we have that's a pretty good example of what the whole product meant to a marketplace is France Telecom. So France Telecom had an initiative a few years ago when they started up their API movement here. was something called Nursery. And that was really about making those APIs associated with all their back-end telephony systems available to third-party developers to build applications. And Nursery was originally just a walled garden. It was really just France Telecom's internal divisions and select partners who could have the resources, the expertise, and the technology to take advantage of this kind of initiative. But France Telecom also has a large presence in emerging markets, and most of those emerging markets just don't have the resources to take advantage of this nursery concept. So, one of the first markets that gave them good feedback of what a whole product was really meant to be, is Senegal. So they went to Senegal. They tried to roll out what was really a very European-styled whole product, or what they interpreted as a whole product, and they didn't get very far. The problem here was the whole product that was needed for an emerging market was really provided by a partner called Emergenov, and you can see them, the orange logo there to the left. What Emergenov provided here was an open source platform for development. So they provided a platform that included things like Apache, MySQL, PHP, MobiSense, OpenSIPs, a lot of the pieces of functionality that the developers in Senegal just wouldn't have access to, and that really formed the glue between what they needed and what France Telecom was offering in their back-end telephony APIs. As well, they offered online disk storage for hosted applications, plus all the services associated with data. All of that was really the tools and resources they need to take full advantage of the nursery. And as a result, they came up with some really innovative products, some really innovative services that were really married towards the local populace. One of the examples they give is something called Kisetu, which, in Senegal, there's very little computing power. It's expensive to get online. It's expensive to use the internet. You have to stay online. Those kinds of things aren't very well done through a computing interface. However, mobile telephony is very popular. So again, though, airtime costs money. So what the developers did for this local market was to develop an application whereby a citizen could use their mobile handset to dial a service, and they ask a question into that mobile phone. The back-end nursery APIs then do speech-to-text using a speech-to-text engine. They convert it to a query, and they post that on a Facebook forum. And then when there's a reply from that forum, it gets captured, trapped, and sent back through an SMS service and comes back onto the citizen's phone where they can get an answer to that question. So something to think about when you're creating a whole product is understanding that marketplace you're going into, and being able to enable those kinds of new emerging marketplaces and have them develop some really cool apps based on those APIs that are specific for that marketplace. So, which brings us to our next topic, building sample apps. So, the whole product, you need to build sample apps, you need to provide people with examples, get those developer juices rolling, get them to become creative. Now, in the past, what happened was you used to get IT involved. You'd submit a proposal, you wait for the IT resources to become free, and then they get it built for you. But the API market is really moving fast right now. There's no time to wait for IT, or is there? So, should you hire some developers to build your apps, or should you rely on IT? Well, I want to give you just one example in our experience. Don't sell IT short here. When it comes to creating apps, there are internal developers who are champing at the bit to get a hold of your APIs. Now, a great example here is Alaska Airlines. So Alaska Airlines wanted to improve their iPhone app. The first version was basically a green screen. They just scraped the green screen, put it onto an iPhone app, not great usability. So what they did was, for version 2.0, they exposed an API to a partner and worked very closely with them to get that iPhone app built. But in the process, they exposed those APIs to a lot of their internal developers. And word got around internally of the initiative. A lot of the internal developers got excited about this. and they ended up creating 2 additional applications that weren't really looked for, and they've actually gone on to become very popular. So today, if you log into Facebook and go to the Flying Social application from Alaska Airlines, you can get a map, as shown here, a map of all your friends and family just plotted there. And if you click on one of those, it'll pop up a dialog that shows you how you can use Alaska Airlines to fly there. So it gives you the lowest rate available today to go and connect with your friends and family. There's also another one, Alaska Mobile Track, whereby Alaska Air Cargo customers can just send a text message via their iPhone application, text a message of their shipping number, and then they can receive a text message and reply that shows exactly where their package is en route. So again, once you've exposed those APIs, don't discount the internal developers. There's a lot of cool things that they're champing at the bit to get done, and when they're empowered like this, you can count on them to deliver as well. John, you got anything to say here?
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, because going back to how do you promote your APIs, one of the things you can do internally, and I like that example because so many of the examples, certainly the ones that get exposed in the media and the press like us, are the public-facing applications or the engagement with third-party developers. But going back to hackathons, the great strategy can be also to have internal hack days. And so this is also a bit of a recommended best practice is once you have an API, or as you're developing your API, even before it's public, internally to have internal hack days and get your, whether it's IT or folks from business units building on your API and getting internal apps or even just plain old creative and fun ideas on top of that platform.
Yeah, that's a great idea too. I like that. So let's talk about incentivizing. So as a vendor, we're Layer 7, we're a vendor in this space. We talk to both technical-oriented and business-oriented prospects about, just what they'd like to do with their APIs. And, not surprisingly, there's a bunch of technical people that we talk to, and they have some very cool ideas for projects their APIs could power if they could get those resources to do it. And the business people we talk to, they've got some great ideas on how to capture a new market space. All they need is just a critical mass of developers. So there's one side that believes that just playing with cool technology is all the incentive good coders should require. But on the other side, we've got the business people who really just want to show them the money. So what should you do here? Should you follow the code or should you follow the money? So there's a bit of a surprise here. It's a tie. They're both equally as important here. So this is one example where the geeks in the suits can really work together to create something that's bigger than the sum of the parts. When you post code examples and your API documentation on community code sites like GitHub, what you're saying to the audience out there, to the developers out there, is that not only do you speak their lingo, but you're willing to go where they are. You're not forcing them to come to you. And on the flip side, you want to enrich those developers, so you want to make sure that developers can easily understand your value prop, how they're going to get paid, how they're going to get recognized for their effort as well. Because in many cases, fame is just as good as fortune. If you can provide an incentive for developers to really get their name out there and make a name for themselves, that's just as good as getting them paid. John, any comments? No? We have lost John for a second. I'm going to...
Sorry, I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Okay.
Yeah.
You want to weigh in here now?
Yeah. The two quick things. One is that I think, it's great to use GitHub as an example here because you should think about it sort of in two ways. One is use tools like GitHub as a way to promote your own library, source code, I think that you're doing with the community, as well as encouraging third parties to build wrappers and toolkits and apps on top of your platform, and again, share those back out through the social mechanisms. And from an incentive perspective, incentives run the whole gamut, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that developers are interested in succeeding. And so, again, how do you get them to build apps and then, again, help them get those apps promoted, sold, monetized, and have a long lifetime?
Right, right. Good examples here. So PayPal. PayPal is a terrific example on GitHub. You can see their listing here. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's a number of PayPal or members of PayPal who have been on the site. There are users listed here, and they've actually created repositories directly on the site. So they're promoting themselves, but also informing the community and delivering that code directly there so that you're going to where those developers are. On the right-hand side, we've got BBY Open. BBY Open is Best Buy's open APIs, and they're encouraging developers to go ahead and create applications here. And their incentive here is really about remuneration. So making it easy for developers to understand what's going to happen when they create an application. In this case, when they create an application and one of their users purchases something from Best Buy, they're going to get a kickback. And the rates are all listed here depending on what's bought, what's purchased. So you know exactly how you're going to be rewarded using BBY Open. So this kind of thing, making it very, very transparent for the developer, is always going to be an easy way for you to promote and enforce or reinforce that your APIs out there. That was a toughie. We'll end off with a nice, easy one. So when it comes to advertisement, what do you think? Should you be wanting word-of-mouth advertising or marketing? I think that's pretty clear. Everybody would appreciate word of mouth. So no contest. Developers are notoriously immune to marketing spiels, but they do appreciate being recognized for their contributions. So, one example in our case, Layer 7's API management solution, we incorporate two methods of recognition for developers that really help contribute to the community and the overall business. Number one is forum participation. So we track, in order to understand, who's contributing the most to the online community. So developers who post more in the forums get accredited with the stars that you see here. Maybe 1 star for 50, 2 stars for 100 posts, 3 stars for 300 posts, that sort of thing. So you understand how they're contributing, who is the most important person within your community. The other way we track them is through reporting capabilities. So we give you the ability to track which developer is doing what and which application is actually driving the most traffic to your site. So once you've got that kind of information, you can appropriately reward those key developers. And that's probably going to increase their loyalty and the likelihood they'll stick around to help out those new developers and even bring new developers into your community to help start building applications themselves. John, any comments?
Yeah, we've talked to a lot of API providers over the years, and this is really key. The idea of watching what developers are building. So once your platform is out there, having those tools in place and your own KPIs and metrics to watch and understand what makes a successful developer and help see the ones that are either succeeding or have that promise and then helping them get there. And so it's great to be able to have, it's important to be able to have those tools and that business and process infrastructure behind it.
Right. So we've gone through all the promotion. Once you've captured those developers, you'll need to make sure they have the resources and the tools they need to understand how your APIs work. So, first up, good documentation is always key. There's a bunch of best practices here: clean, easy to read layout, good examples, history of previous versions. But really what you're doing here is you're making sure that the audience that you've captured can really get from 0 to 60, as John said, in a very, very short time. You want them building out those applications as quickly as possible. And documentation, of course, has to be there, but even more important is that interactivity. So, here's a sample screenshot of what we provide in the Layer 7 API management solution. It's really called our API Explorer, and this really allows you to interact with those APIs in the back end. What you're trying to do is to say, okay, I know a little bit about this API, I've read about the documentation I need here. What I want to do is understand, when I submit a request, what does that query look like? What does a response look like? If I layer on authentication, how does that interact with that back end? What kind of responses does it get? What happens if I don't put any authentication in there? What kind of error messages can I expect? All of that you can provide an interactive experience through some sort of API Explorer like this that allows you to interactively discover the back end rather than just reading about it in documentation. So that can be really key. We talked a little bit about forums. Forums are the primary place for developers. That's where they're going to turn for help. You've got to make sure that you've got a forum in place that provides, developers supporting developers. So have a community area where just developers go in, they can talk about the APIs, you can monitor there, but really it's all about the community. But you also have to provide a dedicated tech support resource. So you want somebody to provide that tech support resource who can be there to answer any technical questions, any errors, any messages that they might have. You want to streamline that process, make it as simple as possible. One of the key things here, we talked about API evangelists. For your forums, you should be thinking about a community manager. A community manager is really somebody who can foster that growth, who can really, tie people together, understand who those developers are, match them up with newcomers, help them, guide them along the way, somebody like that. And of course, you want to make those forums as interactive as possible, so open them up. You need to provide a way for developers to upload sample code or upload sample applications. That sort of thing will always keep developers coming back and helping you promote your own APIs. And then finally, the last thing you should think about is just reporting. So if I'm a new developer, how do I know which APIs are hot out there? If you've got an API reporting vehicle available to them, they'll be able to check out those APIs, understand which ones that most developers are using, and then go and read the docs around those, or go in and play with them in the API Explorer, understand how they work better. It gives them sort of a guidepost along the way of what they need to look at when they're going to create a product using your APIs. I think that's all we had right now. I think we're just going to throw it open in the last 15 minutes we've got here for questions. So any questions you've got, as I said before, please just type them into the chat window or the Q&A window, or send them to us, tweet them to us, hashtag L7webinar, and we will play those back and get you some answers. So I've got a question here. Is there any hard data about hackathon role in API promotion, or any good stories around that? John, do you have something to talk about that? Have you got some data around hackathons?
Well, part of our data is what we had earlier, which is just simply in terms of the volume of them, and I think that to some extent that reflects the success. If you look at a number of the companies that are leaders, again, going back to, say, Twilio, for example, they've been running hackathons, and actually before that even contests. I think hackathon is a form of, it's an in-person contest. You can also have online contests, but they've done it since almost day one for that company. And originally with weekly, so Twilio used to have a weekly netbook giveaway that they ran. And then they grew that to be these in-person hackathons, and again, these collaborative ones. Another way to look at hackathons is to think about how you might tie that into an existing event. So often you'll see hackathons as either the same day or day before or a day after a larger conference or event. And I think that's also a good way to make those successful.
Okay. And we've got a webinar coming up with Kin Lane, in fact, one of the premier API evangelists out there who is dedicated to running hackathons. And he'll be with us on July 12th talking about how to run a successful hackathon. So I think we're going to get more data from him at that time as well. Be sure to tune in. So here we have another question. What are the key skills you look for in an API developer? John, you want to weigh in here?
So I think key skills, let's clarify API developer. So as a consumer of an API, as opposed to the developer who's actually building the API, because there are developers on both sides, but let's look at the person building on that platform. Typically, what we see is that you have to have the basic technical chops, but today, API developers often are what they call polyglot. You speak many languages, many programming languages, so APIs, almost by definition, are language neutral, so REST and SOAP and JSON, XML. People are building on top of those using Java and .NET, but they're also using Python and Ruby. And so I think that, and the ability to use you can either use one of those, but you can use many. So I think it's often helpful because you use a suite of tools, and in today's programming world, you often, it helps to be capable in multiple languages. And then secondly, you need to wear a lot of hats. You need to be adaptable because this is you have to be willing to learn because you're going to be able to jump on these new APIs and get running quickly.
Yeah, I'd agree there. I'd second that. We see a lot of people out there who have multiple skills, who are wearing many hats. The rise of the DevOps seems to be, one of those forces out there that are really coming to the fore. People who can not only develop against it, but also bring it online and actually manage that thing as well. So really wearing a lot of hats is one of the key things you look for in an API developer. Got another question here. Any concern security regarding the use of API? So concerns around security. We always get that question. We are, a security vendor. Our gateway, our API proxy sits in front of APIs. So we are currently looking at things like OAuth. OAuth is one of the premier ways of securing an API. So today we offer a toolkit on our API proxy that allows you to very simply layer on an OAuth 1.0 or OAuth 2.0 requirement in front of your APIs. And that can help you secure those APIs and actually make them more available to programmers who are really looking for that sort of thing today. They're getting used to that whole OAuth model that's out there. John, anything else to add?
Probably two things here. I think one, of course it's important, but like so many things, security doesn't necessarily, in other spheres, security isn't always at the forefront of a developer's mind as you're building the platform, but of course it should be. So it's helpful to have tools like your gateway to help. And APIs can be subject to a new class of exploits. So there's some of the old ones like SQL injection, and that can happen through an API. But there are new ones out there that one needs to be aware of, and I think it's helpful to come up to speed on those and to think about, what are the tools and processes you need in place to prevent them.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a good point. The old SQL injections, code injections, things you can protect against, cross-site request forgeries, stuff like that you need to protect against is things that you don't want your API programmer to actually build into the API. These are things that are better layered on top from a third party, somebody who's dedicated to that security, rather than having a mix and match of all the API developers and their different skills in security trying to build something consistent across all of your APIs. It's much better just to layer this on in front from a single vendor. That way you have a single point from which you can manage all of those requirements as they evolve and change over time. So here's another good question. Do you have any anti-patterns for API development and examples? So I guess what we're talking about is things you shouldn't do. And I'm guessing that, right here, security seems to be one of those anti-patterns. Trying to get a consistent security model applied by all your different programmers to all your different APIs is one of the things you probably don't want to do. You want to make sure that it's standardized and removed from the API, layered on in front of it so that you get a consistent view into that. Are there any other anti-patterns that you've seen out there, John, things that people shouldn't be doing?
Well, there's a number of them in the provider side. So, for example, in terms of building an API. So, one is if you're building a REST API, really you don't have to be pure REST, and folks, like any good technology, people will get into religious wars about it. But I think there are a number of best practices. So a classic positive pattern to follow is using in a REST API HTTP return codes, like a 200 for success or 404, and those sorts of things. It's amazing how many APIs are out there that either don't use those or misuse those. So there's an anti-pattern, not understanding what they are or misusing them. And then later in the support phase, which again is just as important, is we see APIs where the documentation is in a giant PDF file that says click here to download the docs, and that's so 1998. You really need to have think about what that developer experience is, and again, all the way through the life cycle.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. We have another question. Will you be covering installation or configuration? That sounds a little too detailed for our current talk today. I'm not exactly sure what he means by installation and configuration. Does that ring any bells for you, John?
No, I think part of the magic of a web API is that there's less to install and configure.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. What are some examples of forums and communities managed by Layer 7? There's a number of different customers that we have out there today. You can, in most cases, what we've done is we've enabled a lot of customers to set up a forum, set up a community, and bring that online. In our own product, which GA'd in March of this year, we have a lot of customers who are currently rolling it out and testing it internally at this time. So there's a lot of customers who are kicking the tires around it, who are working hard to get these things up and running and bring them into the marketplace, but they've only had a few months since we've GA'd the product. Hoping to announce a lot of our new customers as they roll into production this summer, so look for that coming up from us. Another question, is REST the web protocol choice as opposed to traditional SOAP for API? John, I think you talked a little bit about this. You want to just give me your thoughts?
Sure. And going back to some of those slides with the data that we've seen, there's not a lot of doubt that REST is the predominant and growing choice for how to expose an API on the web. It's not the only choice. We go back to that chart, one subtle footnote there was that it wasn't that there were no new SOAP APIs. So there are new SOAP APIs coming out, but they are the minority, and the lion's share is really a REST-based model, and again, for reasons in particular around simplicity, ease of adoption, and all the benefits that go along with being effectively a model. It's not really a protocol per se, but a model that's based around the way that the web works.
Yeah, and I'll say from our end, we have quite a few enterprises that we've worked with over the years who are still SOAP-based, and they'd like to come into this new REST-based world. So what our API proxy can do for them is automatically translate the incoming REST call from a developer to their SOAP-based end. So there's no reason to force the developer to use SOAP calls to access the API. They can actually expose this directly as a REST call. And similarly with XML versus JSON. So if their original API only responds in SOAP and XML, we can actually translate that XML back to JSON using that same kind of transformation. So the developer, the end-user developer, can work comfortably in this new REST and JSON world, even while hitting those back-end SOAP and XML-based APIs. We'll give it a few more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, we'll just check the Twitter feed. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour anyway, so I guess that's a wrap. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you, John Musser, ProgrammableWeb, for joining us as well.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody. Goodbye now.